From the Australian National University College of Law, this is Law and Crisis, bringing you interdisciplinary perspectives on the questions we're confronting today that will shape our future. In this episode, Professor Desmond Manderson explores how governments have dealt with trust and transparency with visiting fellow Kieran Pender.
Welcome to another episode of Law and Crisis, and I'm pleased to be talking today to Kieran Pender. He is a legal advisor with the International Bar Association, and he's also a visiting fellow in the Centre for International and Public Law, and he's holding out against the pandemic here in Australia in a safe environment, having worked for a couple of years in London with the IBA. Kieran, your expertise is in protection for whistleblowers, both national and I guess mainly international protection. Why should we worry about that in the context of the pandemic? Don't we have other things to be thinking about?
I think the pandemic has thrown the spotlight on the lack of protections that we have for whistleblowers, both domestically and transnationally. We saw, the first person to blow the whistle, so to speak, on coronavirus, being Dr. Li in China, was subsequently arrested for spreading malicious false information. Obviously, we now know that is very much not the case, and we've seen literally hundreds of examples around the world in the last 2 or 3 months of doctors, nurses, medical staff, calling light to a lack of preparedness, unsafe work environments, a lack of supplies, etc., and many of whom have lost their jobs for speaking up. There's been some very disturbing cases in Russia of whistleblowers who have perhaps disappeared. Whether or not those stories are verified, I'm not sure. But I think that the pandemic has really forced us to confront the fact that as societies, we don't do a good job protecting those who speak up. And right now, more than ever, we need people to speak up.
Right. So there's a question of communication. I mean, I think about that image, there was that famous image of Dr. Li just before he died, when he's lying in a hotel bed with a mask on his face and holding his ID card up to the camera so we know who he is, and I thought that's an image of, the pandemic, that's an image of sickness and so on. But it's actually in some ways even more an image of bureaucracy and silence, isn't it? The masks and the identity card and the story, which is really a story about administrative arrogance or administrative indifference, however you want to put it, that was part of the catalyzing forces in the explosion of this pandemic. So it's kind of, I think what makes that image iconic is actually the way in which it connects the pandemic to questions of bureaucracy and silence and resistance to the free flow of information, particularly when things go wrong.
Yeah, certainly. And also a broader underlying societal failure to create structures, institutions, and a climate that's supportive of truth-telling. And we see both in the public sector and the private sector, when people speak up, they have bad experiences. They lose their jobs, they lose their careers, they lose their reputation. Some of them, lose their lives in very alarming cases. That's not a symptom of it. That's not a sign of a healthy society. And I think the way whistleblowers have been treated right now is a symptom of a broader malaise in society. And then on top of that, a legal challenge. In a lot of countries, we do now have some degree of legislative protections for whistleblowers. What we've seen in the last 2 months indicates that they're not working effectively.
And so I guess that, and I'll get onto those legal protections in a second, but I guess that this relates into a broader sense of what we need at the moment for various reasons is a climate of trust, a way, right? And that's really what you're talking about.
Yeah, and I think trust is built in a whole range of manners, and having robust mechanisms for addressing issues of trust deficits, corruption, malfeasance, those are important structural contributors to the maintenance and the development of trust in the institutions that govern us. Only one part, but I think part of a broader series of interconnected structures and mechanisms that hopefully create societies where we trust those around us and those who govern us. And I think the pandemic has exposed some of the limitations there.
So just to continue those ideas about the importance of trust and the ways in which legal systems and legal structures can actually help preserve trust in situations when they're under pressure. What do you think about Australia's record in this, looking at what's been happening in Australia, both in law and in policy after the last few years? How would you score them?
Yeah, Australia has a mixed record in this regard. South Australia was actually one of the first jurisdictions anywhere in the world to introduce standalone protections for whistleblowers in 1992, following only on really from the US, which has been at the forefront of this. But then it took another 20 or 30 years, really, just under 30 years, to get robust protections in the private sector and anything approaching reasonable protections for public servants. And so I think at a legal level, as of today, there's some deficits, but broadly speaking, we're ahead of the curve internationally. But then there's an underlying cultural dimension to this, which is that there remains a real deep-seated hostility, I think, to whistleblowers. And we've seen that in the way that corporations and society treats those who blow the whistle. And we've seen some really alarming cases in recent years of the federal government prosecuting whistleblowers. We have the ATO whistleblower, Richard Boyer. We have witness K and his legal counsel, Bernard Collaery, right now before the ACT Supreme Court over blowing the whistle on Australia's treatment of East Timor, Timor-Leste. I think those things, those forms of conduct from the government are troubling, and they send a signal that society, government don't want people to speak up in instances of wrongdoing. And that has a really corrosive effect. And it fits into a broader pattern. So it's not just whistleblowing in isolation, it's official secrecy, it's freedom of information regimes, which have been failing for some time now. It's freedom of the press. We've had the raids on ABC and Annika Smethurst of News Corp. These are all bits of a puzzle which in the last decade in Australia have been pointing towards a decline in transparency and openness, and as a result, a deficit of societal trust. And it's not just me saying that. We've seen, just in recent years, international reports, yearly monitorings, seeing Australia's score in those sort of areas decline quite significantly. And I think that should alarm everyone. And I guess the chickens have come home to roost, right? We need that right now. And we see that with the app. We might come on to that. But we don't have it because of the failures of government.
Yeah, I mean, there's an irony there, isn't it, that all of those processes of increased privacy law, protections for government actions, increased security laws and things like that, they've kind of been understood as a way of, in some ways, maintaining trust in government by closing down avenues of communication, right? Government's being more in control of the mechanisms by which communication is released to the public has been thought of as a kind of way of protecting government trust, but in fact, they've done the opposite. They've created all of these kinds of not just breakdowns like the Bernard Collaery case and Witness K and so forth, but a kind of an underlying sense of distrust in governments. And as you said, I mean, you said, the chickens have come home to roost. I mean, let's talk about the COVID app for a moment. How have the chickens come home to roost in relation to what the government wants to do in relation to that track and tracing app right now?
Well, I think a lot of the distrust and the concern we've seen around the COVID app and people troubled by this sense of government oversight, government tracking, whether we trust the government with our data, I think a lot of that concern is fed by government action and inaction in the last decade or so around these areas that we've just discussed. If we had robust whistleblower protections, if the government wasn't prosecuting whistleblowers on a regular basis, if secrecy laws hadn't been ratcheted up, if we had more transparent flow of government information, that would contribute, I suspect, to a higher level of trust in government and a stronger sense of a stronger social compact between citizens and the government. Yeah. And the fact that it's been eroded in recent years, I think is a very important reason why so many people are distrustful, and rightfully so. The government doesn't have a good track record in this regard. And that's unfortunate because we need them to right now, but ultimately they don't.
Right. And as you said, I mean, it's partly about patterns and cultures and the behaviour of the government and people's feelings about, can we really trust the government when they promise these things? The government's response has been to point to legislative provisions that really try and, lock down those privacy concerns so that people can feel like, okay, this time the government are really serious about these things. But as you know, on the other hand, the intelligence and security laws have changed in the last few years to actually allow those intelligence agencies to ignore those kinds of laws in lots of different circumstances. So we're not even sure anymore whether what looks like ironclad legal protections are in fact ironclad legal protections.
Yeah, exactly. And that's troubling, and I think it poses moral and ethical questions for all of us. Should we download the app? I mean, I don't want to speak for anyone else. That's a live concern for anyone. On one hand, contributing to society and hopefully addressing this pandemic quicker, but on the other hand, very legitimate concerns about security and privacy. We didn't have to have that. If the government had acted differently over the last decade, we wouldn't necessarily be having this debate. And I think it was quite ironic. You mentioned Witness K. Witness J is another secrecy case, an intelligence officer that was tried and jailed in absolute secrecy, and no one knew about Witness J until it subsequently came to light through other means. And the National Security Monitor, independent statutory body, was investigating that and just decided a few weeks ago to cease that investigation because they couldn't do so in the current COVID climate, and their term was about to end. So, I thought that to me was really ironic. We've got this real question of social trust going on at the moment, and attempts to investigate and hold the government to account have been stopped because of the pandemic. I think that's a real shame.
Yeah, I mean, it's so really, you're telling a story of a big picture of a long period of time, and perhaps that we have not properly understood the role of questions of transparency in government's own ability to do the things that they want or need to do over the long term. And that's really what the pandemic has demonstrated here. Maybe just one, last question going to your own kind of area of expertise. What is the role of international protection regimes? I mean, what can the international community or international standards do in relation to this, as opposed to just thinking of this as an Australian problem?
So historically, whistleblower protection regimes have been very domestic and inwardly focused. And even today, only about a quarter of countries in the world have standalone whistleblowing laws, right? So there's a lot more to be done at a domestic level. But I think the pandemic has demonstrated the vulnerability, the shared vulnerability of everyone when other countries don't have robust protection mechanisms, because the failure to protect whistleblowing in China or in the US or in the UK or in Australia can affect every other country in the world. So it wouldn't surprise me. We're already beginning to see a shift towards maybe a transnationalisation of whistleblower protection. A number of whistleblowing laws, particularly the American laws, have explicit extraterritorial protection. And we've seen Australian whistleblowers be protected and rewarded by American regulators. We've just in the last year or two seen the EU introduce best practice, very robust whistleblower protections that will be applied across all 28 EU member states. And I think that level of harmonisation will only continue. The G20 has been very active in this space, the OECD. But what we're going to need to see is both a broader spread of strong laws and better enforcement of those laws. And then I think a move towards a degree of transnationalisation of that, whether through those sort of bodies I mentioned that might enable whistleblowers to speak up and feel that they'll be protected, wherever they are in the world. Now, that's a lofty ambition. It's not going to happen anytime soon, unfortunately, but surely that has to be where we have to aim, because we're not going to be safe from future pandemics, from future, other sort of catastrophic issues, unless people everywhere feel they can speak up. We're a long way from that now, sadly.
That's so that's really interesting, and it really draws together that idea of the relationship between law, trust, value, and kind of the way in which we live together. What it is that we are able to do with our governments, what governments are able to ask of us, and how we can maximise those kinds of powers, social powers as well as government powers. That's what you're trying to say there. So thank you very much. So I've been speaking to Kieran Pender from the International Bar Association, who I'm now going to be calling Witness P from now on, and he's been speaking from a secure, undisclosed location on the south coast of New South Wales. Thanks very much, Kieran.
Law in Crisis is produced by the ANU College of Law. If you're interested in navigating the challenges of this uncertain time, we offer a range of postgraduate degree programs taught by interdisciplinary experts. Start your journey today at law.anu.edu.au.